Okay, so well, first of all, do y'all have any questions? I graded the lab practicals. The scores have been posted. It's out of 150 points. Remember when you see it. Uh, you can review them, of course, but they'll have to be till when we get back in lab next week. But by all means, if you want to go over your lab practical after I pass them out, then let's sit down. We can certainly take a look at it. Any other questions? Anything we need to talk about? Anything about field notebooks? You know, there is the field trip coming up on Friday, but I've only got one person signed up so far. So if I don't get more than one person, I'm going to go ahead and cancel it. So if you do want to go, if you do have the opportunity to go, please go ahead and let me know between now and tomorrow so that I can put you down on the list. Aaliyah, hi, how are you today? Speaking of reptiles, Sean was a nice one. I'm good, thank you. All right, so if no questions, I'll go ahead and get started. We'll finish up chapter 30 today. We'll do the, you have your exam next week, right? Isn't that right? Next week? This is the 18th. I'm all discombobulated because of the hurricane. Yeah, you have your exam next week over chapters 27 and 28, prokaryotes and protists. So it's only 2 chapters. And we will do the other half of Lab 5, which is the plant lab. Okay, yeah, that's right. All right, so let's go on with what we were talking about with the seed plants. So we started way back here with the green algae, and that was actually back in the protozoan chapter, right? Remember how we talked about green algae is one of those weird terms that sort of like that runs in between the ladder of Aristotle, where things that are there are green algae that are very much protozoan-like and green algae that are very much plant-like. So it was those caryophyte green algae that gave rise to the land plants as we know today. And first we talked about the mosses, and then we discussed the ferns, the whisk ferns, the club mosses, and their relatives. So today we're going to move on to the stuff that's in the red. These are the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, the 2 largest group of plants out there. These are sister clades that dominated during the dinosaur era. That's the Mesozoic. So the Mesozoic dinosaurs are around about 200 million years. The Mesozoic began about 250 million years ago and ended on that one day when everything was going well for the dinosaurs until they looked up and saw this asteroid, and it was not good at all. After the Carboniferous, you remember, the climate began to dry out. And I said that, of course, as we've talked about since the beginning of the semester, anytime the climate changes, anytime the environment changes, there's going to be this potential need to adapt, okay? I don't know if that's exactly the right word, because you don't need to adapt. You could certainly go extinct. And then there's a couple of other things that we talked about briefly. If the environment changes, you can also move, right? Basically, we talk about there's 3 choices that an organism has when its environment changes, climate-wise, or when a new predator moves in. They can die, they can go extinct, they can move on, go someplace else, assuming they can find another suitable habitat, or they can change. That is, they can adapt, given that they have enough time. But you can see by this picture here that as this climate began to dry out during the Carboniferous, these guys came on the scene. Reptiles are very good at living further away from water than the amphibians were. So as the climate began to dry during the Carboniferous, as those continents began to come together, and remember what I mean, when the continents come together, what happens is you get that wet on the edges, just like we have here in Florida, but in the interior it gets dry. And then everything in between, from the edges to the interior, varies. So we got a lot of variability in habitat. You got a lot of chances, for organisms to adapt to those different environments. So we get this drying in the Carboniferous, this rapid proliferation of the reptiles, and of course the plants were already there. They had actually had their time. The time of the plants was the Carboniferous time. If we talk about the age of the dinosaurs being the Mesozoic, then I guess we could say the Carboniferous was the age of the plants. As a matter of fact, you remember that's where its name comes from, the Carboniferous. The Carboniferous era is called that because when you dig down into the dirt and you get down about greater than 250 million years ago, is where we find the coal, right? That's where a lot of plant growth had occurred during that time, and then was compacted through heat and pressure. Well, it wasn't compacted through heat, but through heat and compaction and pressure became coal. Now, Later on, as we move on through the Mesozoic, it was initially the gymnosperms that were dominant, but later on, for reasons that you'll see, because the angiosperms really hit it on the head when it comes to dispersal and to basically populating all these different environments. But let's start with the gymnosperms first. The word gymnosperm literally means naked seed. Even though sperm here, you might think about the male gamete. In this particular context, it's seed. Gymno is naked. For example, there are a group of eels out there, moray eels, that are called Gymnothorax. That's their genus name, because those moray eels, many eels have a pectoral fin, one right about here, right? Morays do not. They have no fin. They're slick. So they're naked throats. Gymnothorax, the thorax being the throat. Kind of cool, huh? All right, now what are the gymnosperms? Pine trees are the gymnosperms, right? These are the naked seeds. What we mean by a naked seed is the seed is not surrounded by a fruit. See, gymnosperms don't make fruit. Only angiosperms make fruits. So the seed in a gymnosperm, if we look inside of a pine cone, the seed is laying there right on the scale. If you see this cool little picture that I found on the lower left-hand side right down here, my glasses, there we go. There's the seed, SD. There's the seed right there, okay? And then there's that little wing that comes off the seed. I've got some of these in, it's not exactly squiggly like that. I've got some of these in class, and I'll show you. But you've seen them before. They're the little pine seeds with the little wing. And, of course, you can imagine what the wing is for, because as the wind blows through the scales of the pine cone, it loosens those seeds, and they come out. And that wing helps them stay aloft for a while so they can get dispersed, right? We've talked about how important dispersal is in the past, so that's a good way to disperse. All right, so we've got naked seeds, no fruit. Most of these species are conifers. The biggest group of gymnosperms are conifers, and those are the pine trees. And there's a couple of other smaller groups. But the big thing here so far is we haven't got to flowers and we haven't got to fruits. We'll talk about those when we do get to the gymnosperm. So we've got about 600 species of conifers, about maybe 800 total species of gymnosperms. Look at this. This is amazing, right? Look at this. 250,000 species of flowering plants. Whenever evolutionary biologists look at that kind of diversity, they go, man, this is a group that really figured out how to adapt to many different types of environments. 250,000. All right, let's talk about the conifers first, the phylum Coniferophyta. This is the most familiar. These are the things we call the pine trees, the firs. American cedar belongs in this group. Those really tall trees, those coastal redwoods, you find out in California if you watch any of the newer Planet of the Apes movies, which I love those movies. I don't know what it is. I mean, I know they're cornball, but I love the idea. I think it's such a great story. Anyway, that's where the setting was. That's where the apes were living out there in the coastal redwoods. This is the one you've seen before. Maybe here's, for scale, here's somebody standing next to one. These things can get 300 feet tall. They get massive. And they're so big sometimes that some of them out in California, they've actually cut a space through so the cars can drive through. That's how big these doggone things get. There's the really cool bristlecone pine, which is the oldest, one of the oldest living trees. This is what a bristlecone pine looks like. And now remember, the cone in the gymnosperms, or at least in the conifers, the cone is where the seeds are. So that's the reproductive part. So if you're a cone-bearing plant, you're going to want to protect those seeds. And if you go back to the name of this, you can see quite clearly that those seeds, look at that, man. That's some heavy-duty stuff to get through if you want to eat pine seeds. The bristlecone pine has all those little bristles sticking off, which do a very good job of dissuading all but the hungriest organisms, right, tearing those apart. Very common pine here in Florida is the longleaf pine. We generally think about pines as living in cooler, drier climates, which is kind of weird considering we have a handful of pine species down here in Florida. There's another aspect of pines and of conifers. They also do well in nutrient-deficient soils that don't have a lot of nutrients. I know when I first moved to Florida and I was taking my ecology class in my junior year, my ecology professor was talking about St. Lucie soil, and it was the sand, that white sand you pick up. And I had come from the Pacific Northwest, and I'm like, Oh, guys, this ain't soil. This is sand. But it is soil down here. But because it's sandy, the nutrients run through it very quickly. In other words, the nutrients don't stay high up in the soil where the plants can get access to them. They leach. That's the word we use. They leach the soil very quickly. So the soils in Florida many times tend to be rather nutrient deficient. And pine trees can do well in that conditions as well, even though it's not a cool, dry climate. For those cooler, drier climates, those needles, those are the leaves, of course, that are found in clusters, have a very thick cuticle and recessed stomata, and that's going to retard water loss, which is another good advantage for pines living in drier climates where it's cooler, also an advantage for pines living in Florida where it gets very hot. You remember, we obviously don't have the dry problem, but we do have the heat problem, and that can certainly dehydrate organisms. So these recessed stomata, remember the stomata is the opening on the bottom of the leaf that the gases can go through, carbon dioxide, and I was just talking about this yesterday in my Bio 1. But remember that when you talked about plants, you talked about C4 plants, CAM plants, and it had to do with opening and closing their stomata because stomata allow the gas to go through, but they also allow water loss. These organisms, and this would be more applicable, well, not more applicable, but this would be definitely something that you would find as an advantage living up north. They're evergreen, and what that means by that is they're not deciduous, right? Deciduous trees lose their leaves in the winter. Deciduous. You have teeth that are deciduous. Your baby teeth are technically deciduous teeth because they become replaced as you get older, right? So what's the advantage of having that? Well, that means that during the wintertime when all the other non-pine or non-conifers have lost their leaves, they're not photosynthesizing, right? The sap has been drained down into the tree, the leaves have fallen off, and they're waiting for spring to come before they photosynthesize. But there still is a little bit of sun in the wintertime. A little bit of sun, some days are actually sunny, right? So these organisms, these conifers, can actually take advantage of the limited, but every once in a while, sun that occurs during the wintertime. And on top of that, when spring comes and all them deciduous trees are growing their leaves, these guys already have their leaves. They're ready to go. So they can do year-round photosynthesis, and they can start photosynthesis at the first signs of spring. So that would be an excellent adaptation for organisms that live in that type of climate. And that thick cuticle on the needles, again, helps them, as I said, retard water loss. A lot of important products that we depend on come from conifers, don't they? Right? Timber, 2x4s, that kind of stuff, paper, resin, which is often used to, what was the one I was looking for? Pine tar. You know, for baseball players use pine tar. That's something off pine trees. And Taxol, which is a substance that we get from pine trees that has anti-cancer properties. So, and you know, a lot of the talk about using herbal remedies suggests that the benefit of herbal remedies, remedies that we can find out in nature, is they have less side effects. So obviously that's kind of an exciting I don't know, discovery or an exciting observation that we made out of these organisms, that they have that Taxol. All right, let's look at reproduction. Now, we're still alternation of generation. All right, we still have a multicellular haploid stage. We still have a multicellular diploid stage. The only difference, though, is now that multicellular haploid stage, that gametophyte is microscopic. It's beginning smaller all along. It was really big in the mosses. That was what most of moss was. A moss is a gametophyte, most of what you see, little tiny sporophytes sticking out top. Into the ferns, the gametophyte was that little triangular shaped thing that we looked under the microscope, and now we're moving along, as we talked at the beginning of this chapter, about making the gametophyte, that sensitive gametophyte, smaller and smaller, and protecting it inside the sporophyte. You remember now, being haploid or diploid, it's not a matter of one being better than the other. Organisms can survive and do quite well for millions and millions of years being haploid, as mosses and the gametophytes of mosses have done. Diploid is just another alternative, and diploid allows you to exploit other environments, right? So it's just kind of where you are at that time and what the environments are like. So where do we want to start here? Let's start over here on the left with the actual sporophyte, the tree. All right, so the grown pine tree is a mature sporophyte, and it's diploid, and it has two types of cones. It has a pollen cone, and it has the ovulate cone. right? Now, most conifers have both cone types on one tree. Most conifers have the male and the female type, male and the female reproductive parts on the same tree. There's a word for that. We call it monoecious. Monoecious means that there's one adult that has both sex organs. It's not hermaphrodite, okay? It's like in the case of plants, it's having both the male and the female cones. The opposite of that, for example, you and I, we are, spell it right. Oh, no, I didn't. Dioecious. I have the trouble with it. There's an O in there. There we go. Dioecious. Dioecious means you have a male and a female, two separate entities. Okay? So let's go with the ovulate cone with the female. So in the ovulate cone, there are ovules. Remember, an ovule is a seed, is what that is. And inside that ovule, there's a megasporocyte. Now, that's a diploid, and that megasporocyte is surrounded by a megasporangium. Now, remember those terms. Sporangium produce spores. So we still got spores here, but we're just keeping them inside of the adult. We're not releasing them like the ferns did or like the little sporophytes did in the mosses, right? So inside of this megasporocyte, inside where this megasporum is, the process of meiosis is going to occur. Remember, meiosis makes variability. And when meiosis divides, you remember from Bio 1, from meiosis you get 4 haploid daughter cells. And if you look in the picture there, you can see that there is one surviving megaspore, and then there's 3 little smaller ones. So when meiosis occurs in the megasporocyte, and of course, it's now going to become haploid. See this? It's going to make 4. 3 of them are going to die. 3 of them are going to disintegrate, and only 1 is going to survive. We want to save all of the nutrients for that one organism. The reason why you get 4 is because you have to. It's numbers. When meiosis divides and then divides again, you're going to get 4 cells. It's kind of like, remember talking about polar bodies. Remember talking about polar bodies in mammals when we talked about meiosis? You know, during meiosis, we produce 4 sperm from every gonadal cell, whereas in females they only produce 1 egg in the polar body. So it's a similar kind of idea here. Of course, you can see there is an archegonium, just like we learned about in the ferns and in the mosses. It's just very, very microscopic. All right, so inside of that female gametophyte is where the female gamete is going to be formed. Now let's jump back for a second to the pollen cone so we can kind of bring them all together. The pollen cone is smaller. So the microsporangia have microsporocytes. And microsporocytes undergo meiosis, right? So the microsporangium, the microsporocytes in the microsporangium undergo meiosis, and again, they produce variable male gametes, male gametophytes inside the pollen grains. And remember, I showed you those pollen grains can sometimes have little floats on them so they can float in the air. So it's dispersal, right? So the pollen leaves the male cone, and now, there are times when it pollinates its own ovulate cone. You do want to avoid that as much as you possibly can. And if you notice over here, I put the word wind, and I've drawn the arrow up. One of the ways that pine trees help limit that inbreeding problem is the way the wind blows through a stand of pine trees. A group of trees is called a stand, okay? So the way the wind blows through that stand of pine trees, when it hits that stand of pine trees, the trees deflect the wind up. And as the wind goes up, because the pollen cones are on the out or further out on the branch, as the wind goes up, it pulls the pollen with it, lifts it up over top of the tree, and then hopefully the tree hopes, if it can hope, other air currents carry that pollen downwind. So that's going to prevent some of the inbreeding. Now, I got to talk a little bit about this whole idea of pollination and fertilization. They're not the same thing. Pollination is when pollen makes its way to the female gametophyte, right? So what you're seeing right here, as that pollen is floating in the air and finally makes its way to the female gametophyte, what you're seeing there, that's the process of pollination. And in pine trees, that actually occurs over 2 seasons. If you look up in the little green box I have in the upper right, in season 1, pollination occurs. In season 1, the pollen grains float over and find themselves, in the megasporangium, right? And then the scale, the little scales on the pine cones, they close. Season 2, the female gametophyte and the pollen tube begin to form. And 15 months after pollination, that pollen tube finally reaches the archegonium. You see, the pollen, when it makes its way to the female gametophyte, it's got to grow a tube. So there's a tube that goes down into the archegonium, and inside that tube is the male gametophyte. And that takes almost a year and a half to happen. So pollination is not the same as fertilization. You see, down here, fertilization is when the gametes fuse, the sperm and the egg. So first you get pollination. Pollen makes it to the female gametophyte. And then 15 months later, about a year and a half later, the tube of the pollen grows a tube down into the archegonium. There are 2 archegonia. Both of the eggs in each archegonium get fertilized, but typically only one zygote develops. So only one of those eggs are going to develop. So now we get down here the sperm and the nucleus. We get fertilization. Now we reunite the number back again, right? The egg is N, and the sperm is N, and now we have an embryo, a new offspring that's got the diploid number of chromosomes. And that's going to grow on the scale of the pine cone, and you're going to get 2 seeds on every scale. And that's what the seeds look like. So that's the seeds I was trying to draw earlier. The seed part is down here. All right, folks. And, of course, these are the wings. All right, and then, of course, those go off and find hopefully someplace to germinate, and a seedling grows. So we still, again, have that alternation of generation, right? We still have a multicellular sporophyte. We still have a multicellular gametophyte, just kept microscopic, okay? We'll look at this stuff under the microscope, but just as kind of a, this is the male pine cone. Pinus is the genus of many pines, for example, in Florida, are in the genus Pinus. A microstrobilus, remember strobilus is Latin for cone. Micro, that's the male, the pollen cone. And in the microstrobilus, there are the microsporophylls, that's the little scales. And inside of that is the microsporangium, and the microsporangium produces the pollen grain. So that's the male gametophyte. These are the pollen grains down here. See the little air things? Look like Mickey Mouse ears. Helps them float in the air. It's kind of cool, isn't it? In the female, what we have here, this is the ovule, and this is the seed. This is actually the megasporophyll. Let's write mega. Not bad at my right hand. The megasporophyll is the scale, and on there, inside there, where the ovule is the megasporangium. The megasporangium is going to produce the female gametophyte. All right? Now, that's the most common type of gymnosperm, right? The ones with the naked seeds, no fruits, no flowers. But there are some other groups. For example, there are these. These are cycads. You probably have seen this one in the picture. This is, everybody calls it a sago palm. It's not really a palm. One of those things we talked about in science, how the common names and the official names aren't really right, like holdfast versus roots. So palms are flowering plants, and cycads, even though they look like palms because of convergent evolution, they're not palms. They're not flowering plants. Very large cones. Now, these guys are dioecious, so they're different than the pines. Dioecious means there are male cycads and female cycads, and I've got both cones in the lab. I'll show them to you. We already talked about the leaves. Huge, largest sperm of all organisms, largest, and it's flagellated. There's a picture down below of a grain of table salt, a dust mite, and a cycad sperm. If you look at all those old pictures of the dinosaurs, those old drawings, you see a lot of cycads. They were dominant during the Mesozoic. This is one of the most dominant plants out there at that time. Now most of them are endangered. There's only a few species left. There's like, we got the sago palm, which is not native to Florida. Florida does have some native cycads. This here, this is called the Kunti palm, or the arrowroot. We have some of these on campus. There's the cones, by the way. This is the male cone. You can see the pollen. This is the female cone. And when the pollen from the male cone makes its way to the female cone. They produce ovules or seeds, and that's what a ripe female cone is going to look like. This is the male cone and the female cone of a sago plant. So a little bit of variation in that. But either way, we've got males and females. A lot of the ones on campus, I think, are females, but there are some males around as well. All right, the other group is a group you may not be quite as familiar with, the nettophytes. The nettophytes, common South Africa, it's, many times, especially this one. Well, this is Weltwichia. There's only one species of it, lives thousands of years, and this plant always cracks me up because it looks like it's half dead anyway. But these are tropical or desert climate type of plants. Only 3 genera, so this is a group that's definitely shrunk in size or never became particularly diverse. There's Weltwichia, ephedra. This is ephedra, sometimes called Mormon's tea. Oops, Mormon's tea. There we go. Strict Mormons refrain from drinking or smoking or ingesting any sort of stimulants like caffeine or smoking cigarettes or anything like that. So they stay away from coffee. But this Mormon's tea, where it got its name from, is they would drink this, which had ephedrine in it, and ephedrine is an upper, kind of like caffeine. So technically, you're not breaking the rules. You're not drinking coffee, but you are drinking a stimulant. And then netum, the G is silent. The netum, which have seeds, these are the ovulate cones of the Weltwichia, but this is what I'm talking about. Netum have seeds that are almost fruit-like. So once again, back to that whole idea with Aristotle and those rungs of the ladder. Here is a non-fruiting plant, right? Because gymnosperms don't make fruits. But it's starting to adapt and experiment with this idea of creating fruits. Now, these organisms survive through time with the way they are, but you can see what's back in evolution of time. Organisms, as they're branching off, there are some that started to make these fruits, started to protect their seed. Now, there's some really good reason to make fruits, which we'll get to when we start talking about the angiosperms. All right, so that's the nettophytes, and last but not least, probably my favorite plant is the ginkgos. Ginkgos have very distinctive leaves. There's only one species of ginkgo around today. That's Ginkgo biloba. You might have said, hey, I've heard that before. That's the, helps you remember, right, for memory loss. Ginkgo biloba, or the maidenhair tree, they were very commonly planted. They're not native to the United States. I believe they're native to Asia. But they were planted along a lot of the old main streets in the United States because they're kind of pretty. As you can see down there, during certain times of year, they have this really beautiful yellow color. They're tolerant to air pollution. They're also dioecious flagellated sperm. Typically what they've done, though, in some of these places, and I was in Indianapolis at a conference a few years ago, and I was just walking down the street. It was cold, so I had my head down, walking against the wind. I was looking down, I was like, I took this picture. I was like, oh, my God, ginkgos. We don't have ginkgos in Florida. Very distinctive leaf. In many of the places where they initially planted these, they've removed the females, so there's only the males. The reason being is the seeds, this huge seed, this white thing, when it begins to decay, smells really, it smells like, they say it smells like vomit, and it really does. It smells like vomit. It's a horrible smell. So you can imagine during the time of the year when the seeds were decaying, it was a lovely to walk downtown, strolling down the streets of beautiful maidenhair trees, smelling like vomit. Ginkgo leaves, I've got some in class, are very distinctive. There's only one leaf that looks like that. They have a very distinctive leaf shape and a venation. My wife, a while back, brought home some ceramic thing. She found one of those, you put candies in or whatever. And she holds it up to me, and she goes, what do you think the name of this is, this ceramic dish? And I said, ginkgo. She goes, how could you possibly know that? Well, it was shaped just like a ginkgo leaf. So she didn't realize that, but I knew the name. All right, so that's it for the naked seeds. Now we're going to move on to that 250,000 species who really found a way to just excel, and that's the angiosperms. So what we get in the angiosperms, angio means container. So now we have a covered or a containered seed. So the seed is not naked like it is in the gymnosperms. The seed is covered by the fruit. Now, flowers are things that plants basically make for pollinators. The colorful flowers like you see in the background, this is phlox. That's stuff that grows, oh gosh, in the springtime, like if you drive down 46. There are huge fields of these beautiful, these are all the same species. There's all variation in terms of color, but they're actually beautiful flowers. The flowers are modified from the leaves and modified from the stems, but again, flowers are not for the plant as much as to attract pollinators if they use an insect pollinator. If you look down below in a tomato, anything with a seed, tomatoes, cucumbers, anything like that, anything with a seed is a fruit. Potatoes, if you know, don't have seeds, so they're not a fruit. They're actually a tuber. But the carpel, which is the female part of the plant, is going to become the fruit. All right. So the seed that you see inside, there's many seeds in a tomato plant. All of that stuff we eat on the outside, that's the fruit of that particular species. And of course, the fruit is just like kind of like the flowers. It's not made for the plant itself. It's made for something to come along, take that fruit, chew on it, eat it, and then drop the seeds or pass the seeds to their digestive system, however they do it, just spread those seeds out, right? Dispersal. Very important. Now let's look at the parts of a flower. Flower parts are arranged into things that we call whorls. There's a whorl of sepals. Sepals are the little green leaves that are right underneath the flower. There's a whorl of the petals. That's going to be the colored part of the flower. And then there's a whorl of the male parts, the parts that we collectively call the stamen. The stamen consists of the anther, which is where the pollen, this is where the pollen is produced, and then the filament. Notice the filament in the anther is very much like the sporophyte in the mosses, isn't it? You want to get that, that filament is going to raise that anther up into the air, so there's a better chance to disperse that pollen. And in this particular flower, you can notice that the anther is lower than the stigma. This is the female part. That's going to help prevent inbreeding because the pollen, the chances of it drifting up into that stigma are less than it kind of drifting out in a horizontal when the pollinator, or if they're a wind pollinator. See, not all plants that make flowers use insect pollinators. Some use wind. Typically, if it's a small little flower, that's going to be a wind pollinator. All right, so we have the whorl of the male parts, and that's called the androecium, and then we have the whorl, sometimes more than one, but many times just one, of the female part. That's called the gynoecium, and that's the carpels. Old name is the pistil. These are the female parts, and it's made of the stigma, which is at the top. That's a sticky part. It's sticky because the pollen sticks to it. The style, this is we're talking about the pollen tube in the gymnosperm. Same thing here. This is the pollen tube is going to travel down the style until it finds itself to an ovule, to a seed. After that's been matured, this part right here is going to become the fruit. The carpel is going to fall off, and this is going to become the fruit. That's going to become the tomato or the cucumber or whatever, apple, whatever you're talking about. Flowers can be radially symmetrical. They can be bilaterally symmetrical. We're bilaterally symmetrical, right? We have a left and a right. A radial symmetrical means that you can divide it in halves through many lines that go through the middle. The circles would have a radial symmetrical. Some flowers are complete. So they're kind of like the pines in the sense that they're monoecious. They have both the male and the female parts. And in some species, it's kind of like the cycads. These are called incomplete flowers. This is the male part. So there are male flowers and female flowers. And if I remember correctly, if it's male and female flowers, they're not going to be found on the same plant. I don't know of any plants out there that have male and female flowers on the same plant. If they have both the male and female parts on the plant, they're usually complete flowers. And as I said, flowers are pretty, right? There they are, all different colors. Some are small. For example, your grass is a flowering plant. It makes a little flower. You don't see it. It's not very conspicuous. It's not very obvious because it's going to use wind as a pollinator. These bigger ones are going to be insect pollinators, and very often they're going to be designed in such a way that almost it advertises where you want the pollinator to go, right, with contrast. You know, yellows up against reds, or the center is going to be a different color, or darker, like in these oh my goodness. Brown-eyed Susans, okay? Hibiscus, it's the male part. Some insects, some pollinators, it can sense ultraviolet light. So some flowers that are pollinated by those types of insects, if you take a photograph with them under ultraviolet light, they actually show that contrast, right? The lighter colored petals and the darker colored middle. You're attracting the insect. Flowers are what make plants sexy. They're like, come on, insects, come and pollinate me. Come over, sniff around. I give you a little bit of nectar. But while you're crawling around through all of me, I'm going to be covering you with pollen, right? And insects have little fur. It's not hair, but it's little furry bristles on them, so that pollen will stick to all those little furry bristles. Look at this bee climbing inside that flower. Man, he's getting right in there. And right here, these are the stamen. And notice how the stamen, it's almost like there's a trigger on the floor. When that insect stands on that, the stamen bend over the back. Isn't that cool? They bend over the back of that bee, depositing pollen all over it. It's really kind of cool the way they attract insects. This right here, this is Ophrys. This is the flower. That's a weird looking flower, isn't it? Ophrys is pollinated by this wasp, the species of wasp. And throughout evolutionary time, this is really one of those fascinating stories. The Ophrys flower has been modified to look like a female of that wasp. So the male wasp comes over and tries to mate with what he thinks is a female wasp. And meantime, while he's crawling around trying to figure this out, and maybe after a while, he's like, wait a minute, this is just a flower. He's being covered in pollen. Right? So you can give them a little bit of something to eat, a little bit of nectar, or you can trick them sexually, if you will. Flowers are deceivious. All right, the carpel, the female part, is a modified leaf, modified leaves and stems, as I mentioned. So we could kind of go through a little thought experiment here about maybe how this could have come about. And it works very well when you think about like snow peas or green beans. If we were to split those things open, kind of like you would see up here, if you look in the picture, you can see how it looks like it could have evolved from a leaf. Right, that's a leaf that on the far left-hand side with these ovules, these seeds, right? And then through evolutionary time, some adaptations occurred by which the seeds were enclosed. And of course, what that would have done would have protected the seeds. All right, all of that together, that big bean right here, this whole thing, this is the carpel. Inside are the ovules, that's the fruit. So where did that come from in the flower? It came from the carpel. Right, this is the carpel right here. When the ovary wall begins to thicken, then we make the fruit. And as I said, this protects seeds and allows for dispersal. Some fruits are juicy and things want to eat them. Some are fleshy, kind of like the pear, or not pears, the peaches are. Mangoes, I think, are kind of fleshy. Some fruits are dry, like hazelnuts or milkweeds. Now, milkweeds aren't going to use organisms to disperse them. They're going to use the wind, as you can see. They got those little white, fluffy things coming out of them. They get picked up by the wind, they get carried along and dispersed. But that's what the flowers are, to attract the pollinators, right? If it's a big flower, if it's a small flower, then it uses wind pollination. Fruits are to disperse the offspring, disperse the seeds. Just a little enticement. All different kinds of fruits too. There are like the tomatoes, which were called berries. Things that have a pit are called drupes. These are like peaches and that sort of stuff. Aggregate fruits like blackberries. Aggregate fruits are really many ovaries of a single flower. So this would be a flower that has many carpels. As I said, most flowers have maybe a lot of stamen, a lot of the male parts, and only one carpel. those that make aggregate fruits like raspberries and blackberries and all those kind of things, they are actually have a whirl of carpels, have a lot of female parts, and each one of those gets fertilized. So each one of those little tiny nuggets of juice that are on a blackberry is an ovary, one ovary with one flower. The legumes are the beans. We talked about that. Samaras are dry fruit, and they're going to be using, and it looks a lot like the seed from a pine tree. They're going to actually use the wind to disperse. And part of the carpel, this whole idea of what a pericarp, let me go back a couple just for a second. I kind of went through that a little bit too fast on the fruit. There we go. So the exocarp is the outside, the mesocarp is the inside, and then the very inside of it can be the pericarp. This is all part. This is just layers of the carpel, the female part of the flower. So it's all just layers of this part right here. In the case of the samaras, the ones that use the wind, their carpel is actually going to be modified into a wing, very much like we see in the pine. So again, another good example of convergent evolution. Pineapples are kind of like aggregate fruits, except now what we have is a bunch of flowers. So a pineapple, each one of those little sections on the side is the pericarp, or is the carpel of an individual flower. So in aggregate fruits, one flower, many carpels. In multiple fruits, you're going to have many flowers, right? Each with a carpel. Regardless of how you're made, regardless of whether you're a berry or a drupe or a legume or an aggregate fruit, again, the whole idea behind this is for dispersal by birds and other vertebrates, like the little mouse who's chewing on those berries there. The idea is he's going to be dropping the seeds. There's explosive action. You remember how the elaters that we were looking at in the horse tails, how they can shoot that spore out to disperse. There are some fruits that can do that. The samaras with their wings, right? Dogs, and Cooper deals with this all the time when we go out in the woods, get grass seeds and barbs all over them. Obviously, that's great for dispersal as well. Those little hook spines hook onto hair very well. The fellow who actually came up with the idea for Velcro got his idea from the way the shapes of these barbs. If you look at like beggar ticks or little seeds, we get here in Florida, again, sometimes they're stuck to your shoelaces. If you look at them under the microscope at the little barbs on them, they look very much like the hooks on the Velcro. Herbivore caches. What a herbivore cache is a herbivorous organism will save up food. And so fruits are very important for that kind of stuff as well. So wind will do it. Water, floating. This is a coconut seed. These things can float in the water. Philip, did you get that email the other day about that thing you showed me? That weird shaped bean that looked like a heart? It's called a sea heart. Yeah. Yeah, that's so you use that for your field notebook, by the way. All right, let's look at reproduction of these guys. Same thing, alternation of generation. Let's start up with the flower again. All right, and we're going to specifically go looking at the male part. All right, so the stigma. So the filament, the anther. In the anther, there is the microsporangium. Microsporangium produces the microsporocytes. The microsporocytes divide through meiosis, so that's variability again, and make a microspore. Right? That microspore then divides into a tube cell, a generative cell, and a tube nucleus. The male gametophyte, that microscopic male gametophyte, is inside of that pollen grain. So then that pollen grain floats off, and if you're allergic, you're very familiar with this. You see a lot of that yellow stuff during the spring all around your car. Most of that is pine pollen, though, and a lot of folks aren't necessarily allergic to pine pollen. They're allergic to pollen from oaks, which are many times pollinating about the same time. So the little stigma makes it, or the little pollen grain makes its way. Hopefully, most of them don't, of course, as we've talked about before. But they come and they attach to the stigma. They form a little pollen tube. And down that pollen, or down that style, that pollen tube grows. And there are two sperm and a tube nucleus. So it comes down the style, makes a U-turn. It enters through a little tiny hole that's called a micropyle. Now there are two sperm. All right, we're going to return to that in just a second, why there are two sperm, but I want to go over to the female part now. So let's start over here with the ovary. So the megasporangium produces the megaspore through meiosis. That divides into four, and then each of those divides. So what we end up with is a total of 8 cells. 3 antipodal cells, 2 synergid cells, an egg cell, and 2 polar nuclei. Now, I'm going to come back to this picture in just a second. I want to show you this part here up a little close because there's some interesting stuff that goes on. I'll come back to this too. All right, so here we are again. There's the 3 antipodal cells. There's the egg. There's the 2 synergid cells. All right, so what happened, we underwent meiosis, and that made 4, and then we underwent mitosis, and that made 8. So we got 3, 6, 8 right there. Only one is the egg cell, though. All right, so because during meiosis, the single megaspore undergoes meiosis and makes 4 megaspores. 3 of those disappear, right, and then they divide mitotically 3 times. So if you divide mitotically 3 times, you get 8 total cells. An egg, 2 synergids. What do the synergids do? This is the micropyle. That little tiny opening that the sperm is going to come through. The synergids guide the pollen tube and tell the pollen tube when to stop growing. It says, okay, you're here, now release the sperm. And the sperm are then going to be released into that area there. Now, the 3 antipodal cells at the other end, not sure exactly what they do. But we do know what the 2 polar nuclei in the middle do. Remember I said there were 2 sperm. 1 sperm fertilizes the egg. 1 sperm unites with the 2 polar nuclei. All right, so the 1 sperm that fertilizes the egg makes the diploid zygote. The other sperm fusing with the polar nuclei produces a triploid, a 3N cell. That 3N cell becomes the endosperm. And in these plants, this is one of their significant evolutionary advantages. The endosperm is the food, the starter package we talked about for the young, right? So there's a little bit of food reserves for the young to be able to survive long enough to hopefully germinate and find its own place to live. So since we have 2 sperm, we call this double fertilization, and that's unique to angiosperms. Double fertilization. 1 sperm fertilizes the egg. The other sperm doesn't fertilize, but it unites with those 2 polar nuclei, and we get the zygote, the one that fertilized the egg, and then we get the endosperm. The endosperm is the food, like I was showing you earlier, like at the corn kernel. The yellow part of the corn kernel is the endosperm. That's the food that's provided for the developing embryo. Right? Now, the embryo can have 1 or 2 primitive leaves. That's what cotyledons are called. Cotyledons are primitive leaves. In this picture here, this is obviously a dicotyledon, or what we call a dicot. If you only have 1 embryonic leaf, then you're called a monocot. You're obviously going to have more leaves as you get older, but we're talking about at this embryonic stage. All right, so you see that? And then, of course, that seed finds hopefully a place to germinate. And with that little starter package, it gives it a little bit of an advantage. So, again, we're kind of seeing this idea of taking care of your offspring, right? Of protecting not only the gametes, but also protecting the actual offspring and giving it just a little better chance to survive. Now, up here at the top in the red, the carpels and the anthers, or the male and the female parts, they may mature at different times too, which is going to help limit self-pollination. So the pollen matures and then drifts off with the air. That stops, and then the egg is mature. So hopefully the pollen from the same flower is drifted off before the egg is ready. Under the microscope, oops, went the wrong way. Wait, let me go back. No, sorry. There we go. On the left-hand side is the female part, or I'm sorry, the male part. This is, so what they've done is like they've taken the anther and sliced through it. So you're looking down the filament. There's the filament. And this has actually got a tetrad of anthers. Each of these is a microsporangium that's going to produce microspores that are going to make pollen. Lots and lots and lots of pollen. And then the female part, the megasporangium and the embryo sac. So what happens is the pollen tube is going to come down this way in through the micropyle. And waiting inside of there are those 8 cells. The 1 egg and the 2 polar nuclei. Any questions on that? See them here. So this may be the zygote here. These are the 2 synergids. And this is the endosperm, the 3N. All right, let's talk a little bit about angiosperm evolution. Now, you remember I talked about the Cambrian explosion and how Darwin had such problems with that because he only understood that evolution worked at one pace, which was the more gradual pace. But we know now because of punctuated equilibrium that evolution can occur at relatively speaking, rapid paces. So the angiosperms evolved again. By Darwin's perception, our ability to look at the fossil record with enough detail, they seem to evolve relatively quick. He says the rapid development, about 100 million years, as far as we can judge, of all the higher plants is an abominable mystery. Poor Charles Darwin. It's the Cambrian explosion thing again, but if we look at the fossil record, it seems like angiosperms evolved very quickly, relatively speaking. And again, he didn't understand the punctuated equilibrium. Some of the first angiosperms were Archifructus, about 125 billion years ago. For many years, that was thought to be the oldest. It's now the oldest known angiosperm, but probably not the first. Recent evidence has found that Monsechia, this one on the right-hand side, is older than 125 million years. We think in that picture up above with the fish is kind of an artist's rendition of the way we think that this angiosperm lived. It was aquatic. It had these little things that perhaps they were floats, and male and female parts, right? The stamen and the carpel. Now that they all evolved, let's look at all the different angiosperms. 250,000 species, so there's going to be quite a bit of diversity. So we're going to look. We're not going to talk too much. We're not going to talk anything about the bentels. That's a very small group of angiosperms with an uncertain phylogeny. So this is the most recent common ancestor of all angiosperms. Amborella is the basal taxon. Amborella is found in a very narrow place in the United States, in the world. It's found on the New Caledonian Islands. I think that's Caledonian. New Caledonia. That's what that is. Right near Australia. And there's a picture of Amborella. Doesn't look like a primitive flower, doesn't it? So that's the basal taxon. We have the water lilies, the star anise, and then the relatives, or the star anise, not anise for God's sakes, the star anise and their relatives. A big group of magnolids, and yes, that's where the magnolia comes from. And then, of course, we also we have the monocots and what we call the eudicots. So let's take a look at some of those. The first thing we want to do is take a look at this idea of monocots and dicots. Monocots, again, the name comes from the number of embryonic leaves. If you only have 1, you're a monocot. If you have 2, you're a dicot. Now, we used to lump them together taxonomically. Monocots was a taxonomic group, and dicot was a taxonomic group. But dicot is actually paraphyletic. So many different organisms are dicot. Doesn't mean they're related. Presently, what we got now is we call it the eudicots, which is about 170,000 species. Those are the trees and the shrubs, the beans, lettuce, oak, that sort of stuff. Monocots usually make smaller flowers, grains, the grasses. They use wind as a pollination. So we're going to do it in lab too, but I want you to know these major characteristics and how they differ between the monocots and the dicots. Again, the monocot, 1 embryonic leaf, dicots have 2. Monocots, the veins in the leaves, if you hold them up in the light, run in parallel fashion usually. The dicots are more in a netted fashion. The vascular bundles in a monocot, the xylem and the phloem, are scattered throughout, right? Whereas in a tree, in a dicot, the vascular bundles are arranged in a ring. The vascular bundles, or the vascular tissue arranged in a ring, that's what makes the rings on the tree that you count. If you think I had some pines in my back, or not pines, I had some palms that I cut down. If you cut down a palm, it doesn't have rings. A palm is just a big thing of grass, a big tall chunk of grass So the vascular tissues are scattered all throughout. It's only in the dicots where we get the rings that you can count. Monocots have a very fibrous root system. Dicots usually have a tap root, one root with roots coming off of it. The pollen grains are different. Monocots have one opening. Dicots usually have 3 openings. And then the floral organs. And what we're talking about the floral organs is the number of petals, could also be the number of sepals, the number of stamen, or the number of carpels. Right, all those organs that we talked about. If they're found in multiples of 3, 6, 9, then it's usually a monocot. If they're found in multiples of 4 or 5, it's usually a dicot. Now, I'll caution you when you're trying to identify plants for your field notebook. Very often, this is not a particularly good characteristic to use because petals fall off, so you don't know if it had 5 or if it had 3. For me, the best way to tell monocot and dicot is right up here, looking at the leaves. Right? If you think about the leaves that you might get off of a palm, the veins are straight. Right? Not a sago palm, but a real palm. And then you think about the leaves on a maple tree, they're netted. That's usually how I tell them apart. That small group, the Amberella, these basal angiosperms, about 100 species. The star anise, the water lily. This is the American water lily. We have these in Florida. We have some growing in the presidential pond on campus, as a matter of fact. So the name up here, Nymphia odorata. They smell. That's where their name comes from. And that's the small group of basal angiosperms. The magnolids, about 8,000 species, of course, includes the magnolia, beautiful, the quintessential southern tree with the huge flowers. Look at the name of the southern magnolia, Magnolia grandiflora, big flower. Pepper is a magnolid. Now, oranges are magnolids. Persea americana. Then we've got the monocots with about 70,000 species. About 25% of all species are monocots. Cabbage palm is a monocot. Saw palmetto is a monocot. Think about the leaves again, the parallel venation. Your grass, St. Augustine, is a monocot. Orchids, the rose begonia or the begonia opisthoglossaides is a native Florida orchids. All native Florida orchids, by the way, are protected by the federal government. It's illegal to take Florida orchids. If you're out in the wild and you see one, you don't often see them. I've seen a few of them, but you're not allowed to collect them. They're actually protected. That's the monocots, and the really big group, of course, is the dicots, 170,000 species. The legumes belong in this group. Florida Alecia, Chapmania floridana. I see these on campus, and it doesn't really look like much. You're walking around campus, you see this little yellow flower, but what's interesting about the Florida Alecia is they're endemic to Florida, and that's something that's very fortunate about living here in Florida. We actually are around a lot of endemics. What does it mean when something's endemic, by the way? When we say that Florida Alecia is endemic to Florida, what does that mean? There you go. Only found there. Yep, it's only found there. Now, the word endemic has a qualifier to it. It can be endemic to Florida. It can be endemic to the United States. There are some species that are endemic to a particular small area, but that's what that means. Endemic organisms are organisms that are only found in that one area. So when you're walking around campus, it's got a very distinctive shaped flower. It grows, I don't know, maybe a little less than knee-high. And if I see something on campus, I'll show them to you. I see them every once in a while. And the beautiful swamp rose, that's another common Florida flower. You can see the petals here. Monocot or dicot? Swamp, well, doggone, it's a dicot. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Dicot. Seed plants, as you can imagine, are very important for us. About 80% of the calories that humans consume come from seed plants, things like wheat and rice, maize, corn, potatoes, sweet potatoes, all that sort of stuff. Livestock are important. Seed plants are important for them. They graze on that, even though it's not the most efficient way, by the way. You can see that little equation I got there. 5 to 7 kilograms of grain turns into 1 kilogram of beef. So for every kilogram of cow, that cow will have eaten 5 to 7 kilograms of grain. There's a lot of cows on Earth, folks. But surprisingly, I was watching TV the other day. What do you think is the most common meat consumed by humans throughout the world? It's a good guess. It's not chicken. Sean, Aaliyah, how about you? You would think, right? We got lots of cows. We have so many cows that because of their flatulence, they actually affect the ozone. You would think it was fish. It's actually goat. Goat is the most common meat consumed throughout the world. Now, we don't eat a lot of goat here in the United States, so that means there's a lot of other people in the world eating a lot of goat, right? I've eaten goat before when I lived in Greece. The only thing I really recall about it was the fact that it was drier. It seemed like it was drier than beef. And then down below, I've got a table that shows all the different things that we get. Goat, yeah. Atropine, which we get from the belladonna plant. Digitalin, menthol, quinine, which is a malaria preventative. Taxol, we get from the Pacific yew, which is a conifer. That's been shown to be helpful for ovarian cancer. Curare from the curare tree is a muscle relaxant. The curare tree in South America, that's what the natives used to put on the tips of their, of their spears or of their blow darts, because what it is a muscle relaxer, and it stops you from being able to move. And so if they're shooting, if they hit a prey with this, the muscle relaxant causes it to stop, and then of course you can catch the prey. Periwinkle or the vinblastine, which is a leukemia drug. So all kinds of things out there that we're learning about that plants can actually be beneficial for in terms of medicine. And again, going back to the idea that herbal remedies tend to be preferable because of the lack of side effects. Unfortunately, I'm sure you're all aware of, is we're cutting down a lot of forests at an incredible rate. Habitat destruction. People say, what's the biggest reason it caused species to go extinct? Habitat destruction. You destroy their habitat, they have no place to live. Half of the species we have on Earth today are going to be extinct within the next few centuries at the present rate if we don't do something about it. And we're talking about that in plants. About every year, rainforests are cleared at the size of about the state of West Virginia, 55,000 square kilometers of rainforest. You can see down below, there's Brazil, 1975. And the same area of Brazil, 2012. The dark green is the part that's left of the natural. This is humans, and this has all been cleared in agricultural. So at the present rate that we're removing these tropical rainforests, we only got about 200 years before they're gone. The problem with losing tropical rainforests, all right, number one is, of course, the habitat destruction. Number two, of course, is they do absorb a lot of the CO2. All right, and CO2 is one of the known greenhouse gases out there, and soil in the tropics, kind of like soil here in the Florida, is not very nutrient rich. People think that the soil in the tropics, you might, off the top of your head, think, oh, it's a very rich soil. Growth in the tropics and decomposition is so fast that things that die in the tropics are quickly decomposed and then quickly taken up by all that plant growth. So there's not a lot left in the soil. So when farmers come along and clear this tropical rainforest to plant grass to feed their cows, there's a problem. They got to fertilize the soil. And if they don't have fertilizer, which many of them don't because of economic concerns, when that soil is no longer beneficial as far as growing grain for their beef, what do? They cut down more rainforests. So you have to continually cut down rainforests because of the fact that the soil gets so easily withdrawn of all of its nutrients. It's not a good place to do agriculture. Of course, if you can add fertilizers to it, that helps, but fertilizers bring up a whole nother set of problems as well. Oh, my goodness. So what do we do about that? Fewer people, right? Tropical rainforests have a lot of hidden diversity in them that we need to be very careful. There's always this idea that we are destroying species before we even know that they exist. I remember reading one time that an ecologist down in the tropical rainforest area found I think he found on one tree something like almost 4 dozen species of ants. It's amazing. They say there's more species of fish in a tropical rainforest river like the Amazon than there is all the species in the United States. Not numbers of fish, but species of fish. There's more species in a river in the tropical rainforest than there is in all the rivers of the United States. It's an amazing area. I tried to get a job years ago leading tours through tropical rainforest, but you had to be able to speak Spanish. I figured I could just, fake it, but they did need someone who was fluent. All right, this last slide I'm going to show you, I'm not going to go over, but this is a good study slide, a good way to help organize your thoughts. We've gone through the major features that we talked about, the dominant generation, the vascularization, what kind of sperm, so on, and then I've separated it into the different groups, the mosses, the ferns, the conifers or the gymnosperms, and then the flowering plants. So use that at will for organizing your thoughts about how to separate these different kinds of plants. Folks, that's all I have for lecture today. If you don't have any questions, then I will see you next week. Again, check your field notebook grades, and I'll have, or field notebook grades, sorry, your lab practical grades, and I'll be more than happy to go over those with you in class next week. And Monday, remember, we have chapters 27 and 28, the lecture exam. All right. That's all I got. I'm going to turn off the recording.